Can I talk to you a little bit about what we do at Airbnb? I don't know if you've seen our new Explore. We just did a recent launch of a new homepage and a whole new Explore experience, which the entire product team, which is what we call our designers and developers, really worked hard on that. And I think the thing that distinguishes Airbnb, of course, from other startups is kind of our unusual founding team, right? So we have 2 designers and 1 engineer. So I think that's created a really interesting environment for our design team. This is our design team. Actually, this photo was taken on Monday, and it's now out of date. We've added a new designer since then. So we have gone from 3 designers to 15 now since last June. And this is a really diverse team, so we have a pretty broad definition of design at this point. And so this includes everything from our graphic print designers to user research. Everyone is included in this team. Okay, so at some point as a young company, you've asked yourself, is this the right time to bring in a designer? And I think probably you're thinking about a particular type of person. When people say designer, they tend to think about one type of person. But I think there are about 6 types, or at least 6 types that we talk about at Airbnb, just on our design team. Before I get into that, though, I want to talk a little bit about when is an interesting time to bring in a designer to a startup. It's a lot earlier than you think. Because this is your big challenge, or one of your many, many big challenges as a startup, right, is to make something that people actually want. And a great designer is your partner on this, right? So suddenly, if you stop thinking about a designer as a Photoshop monkey or someone to skin what you've already made, you get into something much, much more interesting, which is a problem solver who works inside constraints. Not an artist, but someone who can take a brief or take an interesting constraint that you've given them and come up with something maybe that was hard to imagine. Human-centered. So a great designer is trained and experienced in understanding people and using that ability to empathize and that ability to kind of notice people and how they work, and use all of that to inform a design response to that observation. They're collaborative. Designers are extremely collaborative in most cases, I've found, and suddenly you open up the possibility of not just prototyping in code, but prototyping on paper, prototyping in all sorts of mediums that maybe you just weren't thinking about before. And actually, this really surprised me when I came to Airbnb. No one was really thinking about prototyping as something that you did outside of code, and how we do it all the time. It's so simple and powerful, and you can very, very quickly do what we call getting your hands dirty, right? And iterative. Sometimes I've heard from startups things like, well, maybe we should just get a contract designer because there's this much design to be done and then it'll be done, right? But of course, that's usually not the case, just in the same way that if you write some code and then you're done, and then what, now you're done forever? Probably not. So all of that. Okay, so back to the 6 types. And this is just kind of what we use at Airbnb. This language is completely flawed, and actually we make really lame jokes about Gloria Estefan, and words get in the way when we're trying to talk about who we want to hire. So anyway, but I'll use the language that we use and tell you some of the aliases. So UI or visual UI design. This is kind of what people usually think when they think about a designer. This is kind of the most concrete, most visible example of what design is, right? And so, by the way, I went around the office and took some pictures of all of the kind of design, basically, stuff that was around. So this is the kind of thing that you would see what we describe as a visual UI designer. That's what this person would leave behind is. It's a pretty hi-fi markup. That is, if you look at it on the screen, very pixel perfect. Something that you could actually, take to production and ship on your product, right? So, So, when you look at this kind of person, the really great thing about working with a visual UI designer or someone who describes themselves that way, UI, web design, whatever it is. If they have a pixel-perfect mockup, they kind of fit in this category, right? And the great weakness here is that they tend to think in static screens, not necessarily in flows, right? So if you're working with this kind of person, if this is the person that you're partnered with, it's just a weakness to understand. Okay. Then we have more of interaction design. Interaction designers tend to be, a bit more thinking about the structure, thinking about the flow. So that's kind of the big switch that you see from the UI designer to an interaction designer. And so, you can see maybe a hint of some structural changes that we're working on right now. Okay. This is another thing you might see from an interaction designer, really working through the details of the flow and how someone's going to be interacting with the experience. So whereas, the quote that you might hear from a UI designer or a visual UI designer around the office might be something like, oh, can you move this one pixel up? It would look a lot better. Or, I think the icon's a little bit blurry. Can we do something about that? An interaction designer might say something like, we really need to reduce the number of steps that someone is taking to get from here to here. It's too frustrating for the user. Okay, and then user experience, product design. This is the next level of abstraction, that third level, and I completely agree that this is a term that came into vogue kind of recently, user experience, and it does tend to be, if someone describes themselves this way, I think what they're really trying to say is, I do this one thing, and also I do some other things around it, and so I'm going to say I do, some things in user experience design. So it kind of allows someone to tell you that they have these extra capabilities, is how I kind of interpret it. And the kind of things that we see from user experience design is flows, diagrams, storyboards of the future, things like that, which is pretty fun. Okay. And finally, user research or design research. Don't tend to leave quite so many artifacts around, so I had to have a picture of user researcher. But basically, this is a really valuable thing for us. I think we brought in, so we have at this time, on our team of 15 people, we have, I would say, 1.5 to 2 people dedicated to user research, and I think that's unique to us as a company, and it may not be true for other people. Like if you're Dropbox, you don't necessarily need to understand your users in the same way that we do when we're coming into people's homes and they're dealing with issues around trust, right? But this for us is very, very important. And then we also have designer developers. They do exist. They are hard to find, and generally speaking, it's probably not worth finding them. We happened across some amazing ones, and so we snatched them up. But I hear a lot that people are looking for this kind of hybrid role, and they're probably not going to be very good at any of it. So maybe just find someone that you can talk to and communicate with, and accept that we live in a world of incredible complexity, and maybe not one person can solve all of these problems on their own. So, but that said, we do have several of these types on our team. And then finally, we still include graphic design and communication design in our team. And this person also sometimes describes themselves as a visual designer, right? And not to be confused with a visual UI designer. Sometimes they will try and tell you that they also do digital design, but again, if you just look at their portfolio, it tells you everything that you need to know. They are even more extreme in the way that they are focused on extremely static screens. They don't allow for any flexibility. If a word, got one character longer, the whole thing would fall apart. So. Okay, so that's those are kinds of rules that we describe, and the language is terrible, and we don't know how to solve that. So we just look at portfolios, and that's how we deal with it. And we do some we do different diagrams of like where, we use ourselves as archetypes in these kind of diagrams. Like, do you think this person is more like a Rebecca, or, more like a Chad, or more like, and we use that as kind of a way to get around this really, silly problem of language. Okay, so I thought I'd throw in a few bonus tips. I actually can't remember what yeah, so this might be a really interesting difference between Airbnb and Twitter philosophy. We don't really look for designers who can code. We just have designers who design. And yes, some of them can also code, but it's, what we really do is more on the engineering side. We hire people who have great product sense and who really care about design and have great aesthetic on their own, and can really pair effectively with our design team. Hire your freelancers. So if you're starting to work with a designer and you really get along, you can suck them in. And actually, this is how a lot of the, especially the early hires, came to Airbnb as a freelance project, including myself. Freelance project kind of became more, and then suddenly, you're working for Airbnb, and you don't know what happened. So it's actually now built into our hiring process. We do a project with every candidate before they come on, and it's a great way for them to get to know us and us to get to know them, and also kind of help them get to know our culture. And we really believe that our culture is pretty fun, and we have, and we're really positive, and we do good work together. And by bringing people into that, it's actually part of our selling point. We think, we hope. This is another one, learn to speak each other's languages. If you're going to be kind of collaborating across disciplines, which I think is inevitable and important, you'll get better outcomes. And then something I kind of threw on there at the end. I think I might have done this maybe only an hour ago or something like that, but this is something that comes up for us a lot, and I don't know if it's relevant for you or not. But if you look at someone's background as a designer, you might notice that some people are more agency-oriented and some people are more in-house oriented. And for us, like the kind of way to understand this comes down to a pretty simple idea that if someone has agency experience, they're going to be more of a generalist, and they might be helpful early on, but they might not have the depth that you need. So if you have a really complex project, or if you have a really complex product that has some tangled interaction design problems, then you probably don't want an agency person. You want an in-house person. You might want, so one of our designers, for example, did G-Chat, and you might want someone who did an extremely well-executed interaction design on the chat experience. But then again, if you have some other kind of problem where it's about, how can you kind of suck someone into an incredibly immersive experience that's highly, emotional and branded, then you might want to be thinking more about someone who can think about experience a little bit more broadly and more structurally, more cross disciplines. So, which designers? I think this is really up to you, and like I said, your audience, your product, and your team. The designer that's going to be best for you, if you think about your designer as your partner, the designer that's going to be best for you is the designer who complements you. The designer who has the skills that you lack and who you can help out with the skills that they might lack. And it's about what does your product need. Early on, you might be able to get away with like a visual UI designer if your product isn't too complex, but that might fall down as your product grows or in complexity or anything like that. So and one last note on interaction designers in general. It's not a great word. In particular, if you notice, we have we have the full, I would say, full spectrum of interaction designers at Airbnb, all the way from, basically from WSD to CMU. Does this make sense to everyone? So, a CMU is typically very much about like structured and reasoning through a problem and coming to a reasonable and logical conclusion that is, can be traced like this, right? And then, and that person says things like, user needs to be able to complete this task in this many steps or fewer, and then they make that happen for an unbelievable number of tasks, right? And it all makes sense, and it follows, a set of patterns really nicely. And then, your RISD designer might say, how can we do something that no one has ever seen before, but is still intuitive, right? And so we have that tension on our team, which I think is really a cool thing. But if you don't have the luxury of having both of those people to kind of get into tussles with at different times and do some sketching with, then I would choose which one is important.